Welcome back. Joining me from Bangkok is Pepe Escobar. He is the roving correspondent for Asia Times. From Paris, economist Philippe Du Fresnay. From Beijing, Liu Youfa. He is the former vice president of the China Institute of International Studies. And in the studio, Yenal Kucuker, program manager at the Turkish Heritage Organization. Welcome to all of you again. Let's go to Youfa in Beijing. And Youfa, was the world, or in particular Europe, caught unawares by the size of the Syrian refugee problem? And when we look at what the G20 discussed, were you assured that they have some kind of plan to deal with this?
Right at the moment, the international community, especially the major powers around the world, are yet to reach a kind of consensus vis-à-vis how to address this, the huge flow of refugees. From my personal perspective, this very issue of refugee is the legacy of the wars in Iraq, in the civil wars in Syria, which were prompted by the outside powers. Now it is too late to address this pending issue, because when the ISIL is in full force to launch the attacks, it is late but never too late for the international community to join hands to seriously, first, to stop the financial resources which they are directing to get the weapons to launch the attacks. And secondly, we need to have the consensus among the major powers so that unified military actions should be done to stop their, the ramping attacks. Thirdly, I think it is the very responsibility of the international community to address the soil, quote unquote, which this ISIL organization or Islamic State came about. So the poverty management, the national rehabilitation, and the national construction are the things which would tackle the issue from the root. Back to you.
Pepe, as we heard there from Youfa, the refugee crisis that we're seeing right now is a legacy, not just of what is happening in Syria right now, but also what happened in Iraq. We also had some criticism from the European Council President, Donald Tusk, who said that Russia's bombing in Syria is now going to increase the number of refugees. So are we hearing G20 leaders here squabble among themselves and trying to score political points rather than come up with a concerted plan to deal with this refugee crisis?
You're absolutely right. And in fact, minor politicians are mediocre in case of Tusk, in fact. Tusk, in terms of a European politician, is a non-entity, in fact. We have to touch on, I would say, the elephant in the refugee room or discussion. It's the role of Turkey. You should remember that until a few months ago, there was a trickle of Syrian refugees trying to get inside the EU via the Schengen border countries. Suddenly, there was a flood. And why we had that flood? Because essentially Turkey told these refugees, you cannot stay here anymore. You have to leave. We cannot account for you, cannot take care of you, cannot feed you, cannot provide for you. Go. And obviously they left Greece, Balkans, and they arrived at the doors of the promised land, which is essentially Germany. So we can say, in fact, technically, that Turkey facilitated this refugee crisis to go towards Europe. And now they are playing a blackmail game, because basically Ankara is trying to bribe Angela Merkel to give Turkey $3 billion plus extra facilities like easier visas for Turkish citizens, plus a no-fly zone, or what they call a safe zone inside Syrian territory to harbor these refugees. So this is an extremely shady, tricky, and dodgy story that is not approached by anyone in Western media directly, and Turkish leaders are never confronted about this as well. And the fact that large stretches of the Turkish-Syrian border are still very porous and includes a corridor that facilitates back and forth of all kinds for Daesh, ISIS.
Okay.
If these, I would say this is at least 100 kilometers of the border. If you don't close this, we don't have a solution for the problem with Daesh.
Okay, Yenal, I'm going to give you a chance to respond very quickly to what Pepe was saying. Is Turkey facilitating this refugee crisis?
Absolutely not. I wholeheartedly disagree with Mr. Escobar because he's putting all the blame on Turkey. Turkey's been dealing with this problem for the past 5 years.
Right.
It's like a floodgate. If you let the water gather behind the floodgate, and at some point it's going to burst. Turkey couldn't deal with this problem. They were able to deal at some point for 5 years. It just didn't happen anymore. Where was Europe for the past 5 years, and how come they didn't really take any legitimate steps to do this, do something about this problem? They didn't. They preferred to look away. Again, with all sorts of problems, we can go back to what happened in the Balkans, what happened in Ukraine. They continue to keep looking to the other side and pretending that things are not happening on their backyard. And this is what happened. Turkey is not to blame at all.
Philippe, before Paris, before last Friday, if we look at some of the other items on the agenda at the G20 summit, I mean, the theme of the conference was collective action for inclusive and robust growth. It was going to be all about economic growth in the member states. The G20 reaffirmed its pledge to add 2% to global economic growth. Did we hear anything substantive come out on that, on how they would achieve that?
Well, as you say, there was a before Friday and an after Friday the 13th in France. Regarding economic growth, you know that France had what they call the Stability Pact. We promised we wouldn't go beyond the 3% limit of budgetary deficit, public deficit. But again, 2 days ago, François Hollande asked for Europe's help and explained that under special circumstances, obvious in this situation it is, we would have to go beyond this limit of 3% budgetary expenses, notably for what I talked a few minutes ago regarding hiring new policemen and new law enforcement officers. So in our case, the economic growth will be maybe a second-degree priority regarding the current situation.
Youfa, the Chinese, of course, were very focused on the growth strategies that they hoped would be discussed at the summit. In fact, the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Li Baodong mentioned this in a statement he made before the meeting. And China at this time is experiencing something of an economic slowdown. Would Beijing be pleased out of what came out of this meeting?
Well, at the moment, China has been contributing to about 1/3 of the growth of the global economy, but China itself cannot do everything to fix the sluggish recovery of the global economy. And Chinese President Mr. Xi Jinping appealed the major economies to collectively manage the sustainable economic growth. And the Chinese leader also appealed the major powers to coordinate the industrial policies to promote the inclusive growth rather than formulating, the investment and trading groups, which would be excluding the interest of the developing countries. And more importantly, we should, the Chinese leader also appealed the international community, especially the mature economies, to provide the steams for the developing countries to catch up, the economic growth. Back to you.
Pepe, we heard the term inclusiveness repeatedly ahead of the summit, that the benefits of growth would be shared by more people than just, I guess, the 1%. Did you hear anything from the leaders at the G summit that assures you that that will happen?
No, and the problem is the BRICS are all in different stages of economic crisis as well. Russia, for obvious reasons, the sanctions. Brazil, because of self-created problems especially, and because their development model for the past few years now, it's over. You cannot rely on China only to develop your economy and your standard of living. China, the new normal 6.5% is still absolutely staggering, but it's not enough to carry the rest of global capitalism on its back. And China, long term, I would say the project is absolutely extraordinary because it relies on the new Silk Roads. The new Silk Roads can create trade, growth, and development all over Eurasia, pan-Eurasia. And business leaders in Germany, in England, in France are totally for it, and they want this trade development integration. The problem is the United States, the economy is more or less stagnated as well. So for developing countries, this is an enormous problem. Where are they going to export to? China cannot absorb all they were exporting in the beginning. The European Union is absolutely stagnated and will be in the foreseeable future. And right in the middle of this toxic mix, now the number one preoccupation is not even climate change, what's going to be discussed in Paris soon. It's completely evaporated already, not to mention that they are not going to come to an agreement for regulating emissions for the foreseeable future. And now we have the number one preoccupation for the whole planet, China included, China, Russia, the US, and the EU, is a bunch of Salafi jihadis, apocalyptic cult in the middle of the Syria-Iraqi desert. So every possible policy that we're trying to organize inside the G20 for the next year, for the next few years, now it's derailed completely.
Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Pepe Escobar in Bangkok, Philippe Du Fresnay in Paris, Liu Youfa in Beijing, and with me, Yenal Kucuker in the studio. Thanks to all of you for joining us.